Lonely Cowboy took in a native girl who was left tied to a fence by the drunk men in town. The heat came first, white, blinding, and merciless by noon. Sulphur Springs Valley shimmered like a sheet of hammered glass. Every breath a cut of iron on the tongue. From the barn roof, a lone crow called once, its cry slicing through the stillness. Corbin Hale paused mid-stride, sweat streaking the dust on his neck, and listened. Then he heard it faint at first, a ragged cry torn by wind, not an animal, human. He ran past the empty corral, boots kicking up ash-colored dirt. There, by the north fence, something moved someone, a young woman, wrists bound to a fence post, skin blistered under the sun, eyes fierce even through the haze of heat. Corbin's knife flashed once. The rope fell. She collapsed into his arms, her breath shallow, her silence louder than the wind. He didn't know it yet, but in untying her, he had just opened a wound the whole valley would bleed from. Dry Creek Ranch sat half-buried in dust at the edge of Sulphur Springs Valley, a patch of stubborn earth clinging to what little life the desert allowed. The corral slumped with age. The windmill hadn't turned in months, and the creek it was named for was nothing more than a pale scar through the red dirt. Only the wind seemed tireless, whispering through mesquite thorns and scattering the scent of iron and smoke that never left this land. Corbin Hale had learned to live with that silence. He was a man carved down to essentials, broad shoulders, sunburned skin, and a face where war and work had left their marks. A faded cavalry jacket hung on a peg by the door, sleeves scorched, cuffs frayed. His left wrist bore a thin white scar from a chain once fastened there, remnant of a battle gone wrong. Of orders he refused to obey. He didn't speak of the past. The horses didn't ask. The anvil and hammer did enough talking. When the dawn light touched the ridge of the Chiricahuas, he would stand at the forge, sparks jumping like fireflies around his boots, his mind somewhere between regret and endurance. That morning, after cutting the girl loose, he'd carried her inside light as dust, fever hot, lips split and dry. He set her on the cot near the window, where the faintest breeze might reach her. He didn't touch her again, only fetched water from the half-filled barrel and left a tin cup beside her hand. When she woke, hours later, her eyes opened like flint striking steel gray-brown, alert and unafraid. Her first words came in Apache, sharp and defiant. Corbin didn't understand them, but he knew the tone. It was the voice of someone who'd stopped expecting mercy. Later, when the fever broke and her strength returned enough to speak in English, she told him her name was Sahale. She had come from the Chiricahua foothills, sent to Lark's Junction to trade furs, turquoise, carved bone, things of her people for oil and iron the tribe couldn't make. "We need them," she said hoarsely, "to rebuild the mill, to bring light for the rain ceremony." Her story faltered when she reached the part about the men, the laughter, the jeers, the rope. Corbin didn't press her, he simply nodded once, as if he'd already known the shape of cruelty. Outside, the wind rose again, dragging a trail of dust across the doorway. Inside, the air hung heavy, the faint scent of forge smoke mixing with the bitter tang of sage. Corbin went back to his work. The girl lay still on the cot, watching him, between the clang of hammer and the whisper of sand. An uneasy rhythm began a silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. When Sahale woke the second time, dusk had spread across the valley like bruised light. The forge outside was cold, and through the open door she could see Corbin crouched by the corral, tending to a lame horse. His movements were steady, efficient, like someone who'd lived long with silence, as his only company. Her wrists burned where the rope had cut them. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her first instinct was flight out the door, across the empty valley, but her legs trembled under her own weight. And there was nowhere to run. The sky stretched forever, the same color as old bone. Corbin turned when he heard her steps. Their eyes met across the distance between shadow and light. "You shouldn't be standing yet," he said quietly. She flinched at the sound of his voice. It wasn't harsh, but she had learned to expect danger from men who spoke softly. "Why am I here?" Her tone was sharp, wary. "You'll take me to your sheriff." Corbin wiped his hands on a rag, shook his head. "No, Sheriff." Then why he looked at her a long moment, the setting sun catching the faint scar along his jaw. "Because leaving someone to die doesn't sit right." Sahale's mouth tightened. "People from your town don't think that way. I'm not people from that town." She didn't believe him, at least not yet. Her gaze drifted toward the table where a half loaf of bread lay beside a tin cup of water. He noticed, nodded once toward it, and stepped back, giving her space. She hesitated before crossing the room, never turning her back to him. Corbin went to the forge, relit the coals. The orange glow pushed back the darkness, painting the lines of his shoulders in flickering gold. Sahale sat at the table, hands cupped around the cup, though the water was warm. For the first time, she studied him, the faint tremor in his left hand when he gripped the hammer, the way his eyes stayed on the flame too long. A man haunted, maybe more than kind. "I saw your uniform," she said suddenly. "You were soldier." He didn't deny it, once. "And now I build things I don't have to destroy later." The answer hung between them, heavy as the heat. She looked down, tracing the rim of the cup. "The men who tied me, they said it was a joke, that I should learn to bow." Her voice shook for the first time. "Do men like you find that funny?" Corbin set the hammer aside, met her eyes through the half-light. "No, but I've known men who did." Silence settled again. Not cold this time, but fragile. Outside, the cicadas began their song, thin and endless, when he brought her a small jar of salve for her wrists. She recoiled before she could stop herself. He froze, then placed it gently on the table, stepping back without a word. Sahale hesitated, then murmured, "You could have sold me back to them." Corbin shrugged. "I don't trade people." Her gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. She lifted the jar, the scent of sage and ash filling the air. For the first time that day, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once, not meeting her eyes. "You can rest here. The horses won't mind company." Later that night, long after she drifted into uneasy sleep, Corbin sat by the window, polishing his old cavalry buckle until it caught the moonlight. Outside, the wind shifted east, carrying the smell of rain. He told himself he'd send her on her way come morning, but deep down, he knew the desert rarely gave anything without reason. The days that followed bled together under the white sun. Morning began with the sound of the forge, metal meeting metal, and ended with the hush of coyotes calling across the valley. Between those hours, Corbin and Sahale moved like two ghosts sharing the same ruin of a home, close enough to sense each other's breath, distant enough to remember the walls between them. She regained her strength quickly. The desert seemed to harden her rather than weaken her. By the fourth morning, she was outside, sleeves rolled, drawing water from the half-buried barrel to wash the horse's flank. The animal tensed but didn't kick. Corbin watched from the porch, arms crossed. "You handle her well," he said. Sahale glanced up, her braid falling over one shoulder. A horse knows what you carry inside. She feels fear before you do. He gave a small nod, as though that explained more than words could. After that, she stayed first for a day, then another, until time itself stopped asking when she would leave. They rarely spoke. It was the silence that began to build something between them, the quiet gestures, the shared rhythm of necessity. Corbin repaired the cracked trough while she patched the torn saddlebag. She cooked in the evenings, blending wild herbs with the few things in his pantry. He found himself lingering near the doorway, not for the smell of food, but for the low hum she made under her breath, an old Apache tune, soft and mournful, the kind soldiers once feared to hear at night. One evening, when the forge had cooled and the horizon burned with the red of dying light, Sahale approached him with a question. "Why do you live alone?" He looked up from the anvil, sweat darkening his shirt. Easier to fight memories when there's no one to remind you of them. Her gaze flicked toward the scar at his wrist. The chain. He hesitated, then wiped his hands. War makes men believe they can command everything. Orders, people, even mercy. I stopped believing that. They didn't take kindly to it. She said nothing for a long while. Then softly, "My father believed the same. He wanted peace with the bluecoats. They shot him for it." Corbin looked at her then, really looked. The firelight caught the fine dust on her cheekbones. The curve of her jaw, set not in pride, but endurance. "So both our fathers believed in the wrong kind of strength," he said quietly. Sahale gave a faint, bitter smile. Or maybe the right kind. In the wrong world. That night, they sat outside the cabin beneath a sky scattered with stars. The forge coals glowed faintly, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled beyond the mountains. Sahale reached out and touched the air, as if feeling for the pulse of the desert. "This land remembers," she murmured, "even when people forget." Corbin leaned back on the porch step, arms resting on his knees. "Then maybe it remembers the good, too." She turned to him. "Does it?" He met her eyes, steady and tired. "I'm still here, aren't I?" The answer wasn't enough to make her smile, but it softened the space between them. In the days that followed, the smallest things began to shift. She began leaving a cup of coffee on the workbench before dawn. He began setting aside the driest wood near the fire for her to cook. Their words stayed few, but the silences grew easier. Once, when a storm rolled through and rain hissed on the roof for the first time in months, they both stepped outside instinctively. The air smelled of iron and sage. Sahale lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed. Corbin watched as the water traced lines down her arms, washing away the dust. She turned, catching him staring. "Does it always feel like this? What when the earth forgives you?" He swallowed, unsure why the question hurt. "If it does, it's because it remembers worse." The rain passed quickly. When they went back inside, the floorboards carried their muddy footprints side by side. Neither bothered to clean them a few nights later. She brought him a small wooden carving from her satchel, a hawk with its wings spread, painted faintly with turquoise dust. "My father made this," she said. "He said a hawk never looks down unless it chooses to strike. You remind me of that." Corbin took it carefully, rough fingers brushing the smooth grain. "And what does it remind you to do?" She hesitated. "To trust where I land." Their eyes met then, and something passed between them. Not promise, not yet, but a fragile beginning. As the moon rose, lighting the edges of the valley in silver, Sahale stood at the doorway. "Your land," she said softly. "It sounds lonely." Corbin looked past her into the darkness where the wind stirred the dry grass. It's been waiting for someone to make it sound different. She didn't answer, but when she walked away, her bare feet made no sound, and still he could hear her long after she'd gone, by dawn. The hawk carving sat on his table beside the turquoise-blue glow of the early sky. Corbin touched it once, then smiled just enough for the silence to notice. The first whisper reached Lark's Junction before the week's end. Corbin Hale's got himself an Apache woman up at Dry Creek by sundown. The whisper turned into a certainty, rolling through the saloon and the feed store, passing from mouth to mouth like wildfire through dry brush. Some said she'd bewitched him. Others said he'd gone mad, living alone too long under the sun. By the time Mrs. Agatha Ellery spoke in her righteous tone from the steps of the general store, "That man's made a disgrace of his color," the town had already chosen its sides. At the blacksmith shop, old Harlan Boone spat in the dirt and said what others were too quiet to say. Ain't the first time this valley turned cruel to the wrong folks. Beside him, Martha Gaines, the widow who ran the coffee house, just nodded. "Seems to me the ones crying shame are usually the ones got plenty of it themselves." Out at Dry Creek Ranch, Corbin and Sahale said little. But silence no longer felt peaceful, it felt surrounded. He could sense it every time the wind shifted, as though the valley itself was listening. Sahale noticed too. One evening she returned from gathering herbs near the ridge, her face pale beneath the dust. There were tracks, she said, boot prints. 3 men, watching from the fence line. Corbin's jaw tightened. He loaded his rifle, not for show but for warning. "They'll come," he said simply. "Men like that always do when they're scared." She stared at him. Scared of what? He met her eyes. Of something that doesn't fit the story they tell themselves. That night, they slept lightly. Coyotes cried closer than usual, and the forge cold for days looked like a black mouth in the dark. The next morning, they came. Roy Tanner led the group, Jed Mullen and Clay Dorn trailing behind him, both still reeking of whiskey and pride. Behind them, a handful of men from town watched from their saddles, uncertain, drawn more by fear of missing a spectacle than by conviction. Corbin was already waiting by the gate, sleeves rolled, rifle leaning against the post but untouched. Roy reined in his horse, smirking. "Didn't think you'd come out so calm." "Hale, thought maybe she had you under a spell." "Leave," Corbin said quietly. Roy chuckled. "You really think you can hide her here?" "This ain't Apache land. This is Lark's land, white man's land." Sahale stepped from the porch before Corbin could stop her. The sunlight caught the turquoise on her wrist. She faced them squarely, her chin high. "This land doesn't belong to your kind of man," she said. "It belongs to whoever still knows how to listen when it breathes." Her voice cut through the dry air like flint on steel. Roy's face darkened. "Careful. Girl, we don't take kindly to talk like that." Corbin's voice came low. "Steady. Then maybe you ought to learn kindness before you start talking about God in the same breath." For a heartbeat. No one moved. Then Roy spat, flicked his reins, and the men turned their horses toward town. But Corbin knew it wasn't finished. Men like Roy didn't leave because they were convinced. They left because they were planning something worse. That evening, the sky went copper red and thunder rumbled far beyond the mountains. Sahale stood at the corral fence, the same place he had first found her. "If I leave tonight," she said quietly, "they might let you be." Corbin shook his head. "If you leave now, they'll just find someone else to hate." She looked at him then, eyes soft but resolute. "Then let me go for my people's sake, not theirs. I can't ask you to carry their war for me." He opened his mouth, closed it again. Words wouldn't hold her, and he knew better than to try. When she pressed the turquoise bracelet into his hand, it was still warm from her skin. "Among my people," she said, "we give this color to those we trust with our life. Don't lose it." She left before dawn. The only sound was the creak of saddle leather and the slow rhythm of hooves fading toward the hills. For 3 days. The valley was silent. Then, on the fourth morning, a dust cloud rose from the west. 30 riders, Apache warriors, moving in deliberate formation toward Lark's Junction. The townsfolk panicked. Doors slammed, shutters barred, men scrambled for rifles. But when the riders entered the square, they carried no weapons, only 3 men bound at the wrists and gagged with their own bandanas: Roy Tanner, Jed Mullen, and Clay Dorn. The lead warrior dismounted Tyen, the chief's son. His braids streaked with gray, his gaze swept the crowd, voice carrying in both Apache and English. "No man becomes strong by making another bleed," he said, "and no land becomes clean by the hands of cowards." The bound men were dropped at the sheriff's feet. The sheriff, red-faced, could barely meet the chief's eyes. Around them, townsfolk stood frozen. Some hung their heads, others looked away. At the edge of the square, Corbin stood silent, hat low, the turquoise band cold against his palm. Among the riders, one face turned toward him: Sahale. She didn't smile, but her eyes said everything. When the Apaches rode out again, the dust they left behind seemed different, heavier, but clean somehow, like the valley had exhaled after holding its breath too long. That night, Corbin sat alone on the porch. The wind carried the scent of sage and rain. Somewhere out there, she was free, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He thought it might have ended there: one man, one woman, in a small valley remembering kindness. But the desert never forgets what begins in its dust. The storm broke 2 nights later, not with thunder or rain, but with wind, warm, heavy, smelling of wet earth far away. Corbin sat by the forge, the coals dim, his thoughts quieter than the dark around him. Every few moments he reached for the turquoise band in his pocket, running his thumb over its worn edge until it glowed faintly in the firelight. A knock came, soft but sure. He looked up, heart tightening before reason caught up. No one knocked this far out. When he opened the door, Sahale stood there, wrapped in a doeskin cloak darkened by travel. Her hair was windblown, her eyes steady. In her hand, a small lantern flickered, the same one he'd given her weeks ago, its glass now smudged by long use. "I thought you'd gone east," he said quietly. "I did," she answered. "Then west again. My people built the first outpost near Dust Creek. We're trading iron and oil now, just as I said we would." He nodded slowly, uncertain what to say. The lantern flame reflected in her eyes, small but unwavering. "They sent me to speak with the white traders in Bisbee," she went on, setting the lantern on the table. "But I came here first." "Why?" Sahale hesitated, the silence stretching like a breath neither of them wanted to end. "Because there are debts that can't be paid with iron or turquoise, only with truth." Corbin leaned against the doorframe. "You don't owe me anything." She shook her head. "You didn't save me to be owed. You did it because something inside you still believes mercy isn't weakness." The wind outside rattled the shutters. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured against the Chiricahuas. He poured water into 2 tin cups, handed her one. "You think mercy changes anything? It changes who holds the fire," she said. "And maybe that's enough." They sat together on the porch steps. the night thick with the scent of dust and coming rain. She told him how the outpost had begun, how the elders argued, how some feared another betrayal, how she'd stood before them and said, "Not all hands that carry iron mean harm." "You used my words," he murmured, her lips curved, just barely. "I borrowed your stubbornness." Lightning flared across the valley, white and clean. The wind grew cooler, and with it came a faint sprinkle of rain, just a few drops, scattered and brave. Sahale reached out her hand, catching one on her palm. "You were right," she whispered. "The land remembers the good, too." Corbin turned toward her. "And if it forgets again, then we remind it." The words settled between them like an oath. She looked down at the lantern flickering between their boots. "I'll be leaving again soon. There's work to be done. But this—" She touched the lantern. "This light burns with your oil and my wick. It can't stay alive if one of us stops tending it." He studied her face, every shadow and glint of light the storm revealed. "Then I'll keep the oil ready." For the first time, she smiled small, real, tired in the way only survivors smile. "And I'll bring the wick." She rose to leave, but he reached out, gently catching her wrist. The gesture wasn't possession, it was recognition. He pulled her close and kissed her once, soft, certain, tasting of rain and iron. No promises, no vows, just truth. When she stepped back, her hand lingered at his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath the rough cotton. "The desert doesn't forgive easily," she said, "but sometimes it gives us one more chance." "And sometimes," he replied, "that's all we need." The rain deepened, tapping against the roof like quiet applause. By the time she rode away, dawn had begun to gray the horizon. The lantern she carried glowed faintly in the distance, a moving star swallowed slowly by the light. Corbin stood in the doorway until it disappeared, the smell of rain thick around him. The valley was alive again, and somewhere beyond the hills. He thought he heard her voice carried on the wind low, steady, like a prayer made of forgiveness. A year passed. The summer of 1882 came hot and gold. But the valley was different. The rains had been kind, or maybe the earth had simply decided to forgive. Green shoots of yucca broke through the old cracks, and the creek behind Dry Creek Ranch, once a scar of dust, now held a slow trickle of clear water. Corbin Hale worked beneath the sun with his sleeves rolled, driving new posts into the softened ground. His forge still sang in the mornings, but its sound no longer echoed hollow. Sometimes, when the wind turned east, he could smell cedar smoke from the Apache outpost at Dust Creek, a scent that carried a quiet promise. He had built a new fence that week, stronger than before, running along the same line where he'd once found her tied. Every post was straight, every wire tight, but he never walked that stretch without remembering the sound of her voice saying, "The land still breathes." That afternoon, as the horizon shimmered, a figure appeared where the trail bent toward the ridge, a rider moving steady through the heat haze. Corbin shaded his eyes. Even from afar, he recognized the way she sat her horse upright, calm, as if the desert bowed beneath her. When she drew close enough for him to see her face, he smiled without meaning to. Sahale's hair was tied back with a strip of turquoise cloth, her expression composed, peaceful. "Didn't think you'd find this place again," he said as she dismounted. "I never lost it," she replied. "My people call it the heart between winds. Dust Creek Outpost stands because of you, because of both of us," he corrected. She nodded, eyes tracing the fence line. "You rebuilt the place." He looked around the ranch. the faint shimmer of life returning to the soil. It rebuilt itself. I just stopped fighting it. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow creak of her saddle and the whisper of grass brushing against the posts. Then she walked toward the fence, the same spot where he had cut her free, and ran her hand along the smooth new wood. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "Every time I hear the wind change. And what do you hear in it now?" He smiled faintly. "Not guilt anymore." Sahale turned toward him, her eyes soft with something that was neither pity nor sorrow, only understanding. She reached into her satchel and drew out the turquoise bracelet, the one she had once left behind. It had faded from sun and time, the color dulled, but still alive. "You kept it," she said. "Didn't seem mine to lose." She stepped closer, looping it gently around his wrist. "It is now. The desert remembers who it can trust." The sun dipped behind the Chiricahuas, painting the valley in copper light. A breeze rose, warm and sweet with the scent of sage after rain. For a long moment, they stood side by side, looking out over the land that had once divided them and now held them both. Above them, a hawk circled the same shape he'd carved months ago, its wings flashing silver as it rode the last light of day. Corbin's voice was low when he finally spoke. "Guess this land wasn't waiting for rain after all." Sahale glanced at him, a quiet smile touching her lips. No, it was waiting for someone who'd remember how to make it bloom. The wind carried her words away, scattering them across the valley like seeds. And as twilight deepened, the faint glow of a lantern flickered in the ranch window, its light steady, unyielding, burning with the same small fire that had once saved them both. And so, beneath the red dusk of Sulphur Springs Valley, two souls once divided by dust found their way back through mercy and trust. This is the story of the rancher and the Apache woman of a land that healed when two hearts dared to listen. If it moved you, share it. Let others feel the quiet strength that still breathes in the Wild West, the strength to forgive, to rebuild, and to love beyond fear. Stay with us for more frontier tales of courage, redemption, and the light that never dies.